Halo, a game that was so influential, it started the trend of having first person shooter games on consoles. Yes, there was GoldenEye and Perfect Dark, but Halo more or less cemented that yes, first person shooter games could work on consoles and be very popular. It even came to a point where they coined the term Halo Killer, which no game ever really lived up to it. Call of Duty may have come close, but still, Halo was champion for a very long time in terms of the first person shooter scene. Except for maybe in terms of its multiplayer, but campaign wise, you couldn't beat it. So let's just cut to the chase. The problem started when Bungie separated from Microsoft and left Halo in the hands of 343 Studios. Although considering what I've seen with Destiny, it probably wouldn't have fared much better. I digress. Let's face it, after Halo 3, you were starting to see a decline on returns with each Halo. Reach was good, yes, so was ODST, but it didn't soar to the same numbers as Halo 3 did. On top of that, with the way the story was ended, where were they gonna go? I mean, yes, they could rescue Master Chief in some shape or form, which they did, but the Covenant was beaten. Their major city was destroyed by the Flood, and the Flood was also destroyed with the Ark. Well, maybe not destroyed, but it was definitely beat up from the ring firing off. This is where the biggest problem came in, that being the Promethean Saga, or what was supposed to be planned to be a Promethean Saga, along with the Hand of the Prophet. It seems that they were desperate to try and keep that trio of parties in conflict with each other, with the Hand of the Prophet taking over for the Covenant, and the Prometheans taking over for the Flood. And let's not beat around the bush. Let's just call it the Promethean problem. That's where it all started, with that decision right there. The Prometheans were not fun to fight in any shape or form. In Halo 4, the Knights would take a ton of ammo to kill, and even if you did bring down their shields and bring down their armor, they would teleport and both the shields and the armor would be back. And then they doubled down on them in Halo 5, along with its rather controversial storyline in that they made you think that Master Chief was going rogue and that you were going to hunt him down, learning nothing from Halo 2 with the Arbiter. And what I mean by that is that you should have just stuck with Master Chief and not switched to a secondary character that no one really cares about. On top of making the same mistake that they did in Halo 2, they did another cardinal sin of story, which is making a key character that people love and turning them into a bad guy, making them act out of character for no reason. The gunplay was pretty good. It was solid, I'll admit that. Unfortunately, the enemies were not, particularly the Prometheans. They were still annoying to fight, especially the soldiers with their ability to teleport, and they constantly did it without stopping. The rec system was also a very distinct negative, in some cases giving players an advantage depending on what game type you played, or spreading out the pool of weapons so thin that you had to use whatever you were defaulted to, or, in some cases, use some really bad weapons. Halo 5 almost killed it for me. Not quite. I was willing to give it one last chance, which brings me to Halo Infinite, the game I've chosen to review this time around. Let's see if Halo Infinite can salvage the series. I wasn't sure where to start, since technically the multiplayer did release before the campaign, and more or less felt like a separate element to the actual campaign, but aspects of the campaign do affect the multiplayer in terms of cosmetics. That's purely it. So I'm not really sure I should cover multiplayer, because honestly I don't care about multiplayer. I have long since lost my competitive edge, yearning, willingness to be on top. I really just wanted to play the campaign. So I'll probably primarily focus on that and mention a thing or two here and there about multiplayer. So the campaign does start out strong with a very beautiful looking cinematic scene of the USS Infinite being attacked by the Banished, the new sort of bad guys in the galaxy. They're basically a substitute, or not so much a substitute, they're replacements for the Covenant at this point. It ends in a fight between Atriox and Master Chief himself, the bad guy from Halo Wars 2, which is a bit confusing because they're making them out to be bigger and badder than the Covenant, but they kind of lost in Halo Wars 2, so I'm trying to figure out how they're going to retcon that. Master Chief is also thrown from the Infinity, and then fast forwarding 6 months later, which I'm not entirely sure how Master Chief survived for 6 months even in his suit, but he is rescued by a civilian pilot in a Pelican. And this is where the campaign more or less starts. So the whole problem with this is that there's huge gaps of time and events that I'm missing from Halo 5 to Halo Infinite on top of that whole 6-month period, which I'm hoping they didn't fill in somehow with alternate media like books or comics or even some kind of web series of some kind. I haven't looked, and I'm not really going to bother looking. But if they did, it's kind of a bad idea. I mean, they've done it in the past, and it's shown to be a bad idea. On top of that, with the way the story's going, I know they were sort of painted into a corner after Halo 5's story, and Halo 4 to some degree. This is kind of a semi-bad start. I don't want to dwell on the story too much, especially after my Final Fantasy VII Remake review. That went a little too long because I went too far into the story. But I think I do need to mention the highlights throughout the story as we go through the review. So after the pilot gives Master Chief his test to see if his sensors are working correct, where he looks and makes sure the light changes green, which has been there since the first Halo, it goes to a cutscene of Master Chief flying through space with just one bullet in his gun and eventually grabbing an assault rifle and more ammo while boarding a banished ship that's trying to grab the Pelican, which we find out later it's to scrap it for parts. Once you gain control of Master Chief, they waste no time introducing a new mechanic for the game. Yes, they did keep more or less the movement from Halo 5, which includes ledge grabbing and sprinting, which yes, I do approve of. You definitely don't want to go back to the original Halos sort of 2000 late 90s movement where it was super slow in comparison to what it is now. Anyways, so they make sure that you learn how to use the grappling hook, the brand new toy that Master Chief gets in this series. Hopefully they'll keep it in further Halos. We'll see. But as far as Halo Infinite goes, you'll be constantly using this, especially on normal or easy and maybe even heroic difficulties. When you get to Legendary, it's a bit different. You'll be using a different ability once you unlock it. But for the time being, you'll pretty much be using the grappling hook a lot. So this grappling hook is nothing new to games in general, but the way they implement it in this game, it is a ton of fun to use. So apparently when they designed the game, they took into account the grappling hook and how often they knew people were going to use it. I mean, I use it for everything, even just to cross the map at a slightly faster pace or to swing from tree to tree if I can get away with it. Grappling hooks aren't new to video games, but the way they implemented it in this game, it just makes it a ton of fun, and that's the key word, fun. Yes, in Halo 5, the only thing they really did was bring Master Chief's controls up to first-person standards, and that's about the only thing they really did in Halo 5. Here, the grappling hook is a multi-use item. You can use it to grab weapons or explosive containers, or pull yourself towards enemies, which can be a bit of a gamble. You could definitely get yourself killed if you're not careful by doing so. So after having played through the campaign several times, including a lasso run, there's one thing that I kind of question and think should have been implemented in the game, and that more or less has to do with mass. This is the physicist in me that's speaking, because I was studying to be a physicist, and I got a good way through it. I didn't quite complete it, but still. The thing that I sort of realized is that the grunts are much smaller than Master Chief, and so are the jackals. But it doesn't matter. Master Chief, when he hooks them with a grappling hook, will fly right towards them. This is something they probably should have taken into consideration, is that grunts and jackals are much smaller and don't have nearly as much mass, so it wouldn't work for Master Chief to fly towards them. So why not have the jackals or the grunts come towards Chief via the grappling hook when he hooks them, and then he can just punch them in the face or whatever when they reach him, instead of him zooming all the way over to a grunt that's about as tall as a human. Unless these grunts are super dense, I don't know. That's my only gripe that I have with a grappling hook. Otherwise, like I said, it is a bunch of fun, and that's the key thing. It is fun. Enough about the grappling hook. Let's talk about the gunplay in the game. It is definitely a return to form for Halo Infinite. Let's face it, in Halo 4 and Halo 5, the worst parts of the game when you were fighting the Prometheans, and the only fun parts were fighting the Covenant. I'm just going to go ahead and spoil this and say that there's no three-way war going on in Halo Infinite, at least not this time around. Who knows? They definitely set something up, which I'll cover later. But for the meantime, the Banished have taken the place of the Covenant, and functionally they're pretty much the same. Except the elites and the brutes aren't trying to kill each other, and they're not trying to set off the ring for religious purposes, but they see it as a weapon, which makes them an even bigger threat than the Covenant. Instead of religious zealousness, they use it as a tool of either conquest or even just pure destruction, which makes them extremely dangerous. Anyways, as far as the combat goes, it's pretty fluid. Like I said, the gunplay is excellent. It's there. You have aim down sight, sprinting, ledge grabbing, all that fun stuff like I mentioned before. In terms of the enemies you fight, it more or less feels like Halo 3, where you'll be primarily fighting brutes. Yes, there are elites mixed in there, but brutes are the main sort of muscle in this game. The problem that I have is with the AI. It doesn't feel particularly smart. It sort of just stands there and lets you shoot at them. I mean, they will do occasional sort of dodge, either by jumping off to the side or rolling, but they really don't pursue you. They're just sort of standing targets. I mean, compare it to the first Halo. The elites actually moved around while they shot at you, and if you shot them enough, they went and tried to take cover while those shields recharged. Well, at least they did on Legendary, because that's the only time their shields recharged. Here, they just sort of stand there. I mean, the elites will come after you when they turn on their cloaking and then try and cut you with their energy swords. The skirmishers will actually sort of actively chase you, but unlike what's say in Halo Reach where they constantly moved around, they'll stop and take a pot shot at you. I guess the other exception to that are scripted events with the brutes in certain hallways and stuff like that, along with the brute chieftains. Otherwise, they just, like I said, they stand there. I can show you on my lasso run where they just sit there and let me shoot them with rocket launchers. Yeah, they'll do some evasion and try and step out of the way, but this sort of also leads to the other part that I have a problem. I didn't notice it at first when I was playing on normal, but when you do a lasso run, it's very much apparent that they just sort of, in order to make them harder, they made them really, really super accurate, which in general is something that a lot of companies do in order to try and increase the difficulty of their AIs, just to make them more accurate. It's lazy game design as far as I'm concerned. They did a much better job with Halo 1, where, you know, they dodged and ducked around and tried to take cover when you shot them. I really took notice after my lasso run when I just played the game on normal for kicks, in which they were making shots that I have no idea how they made them. They had weapons that had an arc to them. They were making those arcs perfectly. The only difference between Legendary and normal is the rate of fire and amount of damage the weapons do. I kind of thought the AI was very similar to AI from the 90s. Late 90s and early 2000s in particular. But it was just so basic that it felt like a step backwards in terms of its AI and not a step forward for the series. I don't know, maybe I'm just being too harsh. I've never made a game in my life. I would love to study game design and actually do so. But at this point, until I do, I'm just going to call it the way I see it. The AI in this game is just fundamentally dumber than what it has been. And it feels like they didn't put as much effort into it as they could have or even probably should have. It just functions, and that's about all it does. Anyways, getting back to the story for a little bit. Master Chief scuttles the banished ship he's on, and he gets a signal for a weapon, in which he goes to pick it up. So this is where you're actually on the ring, and the ring feels like the very first Halo, but nicer and shinier. It has similar sort of structures in it that you will be sort of familiar with if you've ever played the first Halo, along with the light bridges and all that other fun stuff. It's also not just a recreation of Halo using better technology. It reflects the damage that you saw in the cutscene before you actually descended onto the ring, giving it a very nice aesthetic touch, showing that something happened and you still don't know why, adding a layer of mystery to the story. So after realizing that not having an AI sidekick was a bad idea after Halo 5, where they obviously thought that Blue Team would sort of substitute for the lack of, let's say, Cortana or any other AI, they introduced Weapon, the new AI that will be John's companion throughout the campaign. I don't really care for the name Weapon, so I'm just going to call her Chipper Cortana, mainly because she looks like Cortana, but has a much more chipper attitude. So when John interacts with the pedestal she's on, she tells him that he's been out for 6 months. This sort of raises some questions for me, considering you start out the game with Master Chief being thrown from the US Infinite and not showing any part of this mission. So how did she get onto the ring and think that her mission was complete and all that other fun stuff? It seems like a huge sort of gap in the story that they didn't really bridge very well, and I'm sort of wondering if it's covered in alternate material. I mean, if they did, that's just really bad game design. So Chipper Cortana's mission was to infiltrate the ring because she was a copy of Cortana, thus being able to easily access and get by Cortana's systems and delete Cortana. Cortana is dead by this point, but she is confused as to why she hasn't been deleted after her mission was done, because that was what was supposed to happen. John, being the ever-dutiful soldier that he is, tells her that the mission changed, and it always does. So in an emotional moment for both the players and Master Chief, she's downloaded into the chip that Master Chief keeps on him. This is to serve as bringing Master Chief up to the status quo of him and Cortana, more or less fighting side by side in order to protect the human race, in this case probably the whole entire galaxy. Chipper Cortana will engage in banter, just like the original Cortana, but not quite in the same way.
Did I miss something? There's a file that's been unlocked, but I don't have access.
We need a route out of here.
Okay, let's see. There's a breach close by. It should lead us to the surface. In my sleep? Not that I sleep, but... Oh! I don't need to. It's already on its way down. These are the banished.
Affirmative.
They smell even worse than I imagined.
You can smell them.
Well, an array of sensors in your armor can, and I analyze the input. You smell fine, by the way.
She's much more pleasant, and like I said, there's a reason why I called her Chipper Cortana. I mean, her personality is not exactly the same as Cortana, even though she's supposed to be an exact copy of Cortana, but she doesn't behave in the same way. And as much as I hate to engage in apologetics for lack of story, this could be because she doesn't have the same amount of information that Cortana had, along with not being as old as Cortana is. Or was in this case. Overall, the character was fun. I enjoyed the banter that she had with the Chief, especially in the first part of the game when they're sort of getting to know each other. And she's learning more about the banished forces as you play throughout the game. And the voice acting is pretty good in this game. Master Chief's voice actor, Steve Downes, still plays his role as Master Chief, and he's just as good as he was in the first Halo. Jen Taylor, the voice actress for Cortana, voices Weapon, or Chipper Cortana. Like I said, she's supposed to be an exact copy, so that makes sense. After the Master Chief retrieves Weapon and fights his way to a lift, and after activating said lift, a boss comes down. Yes, another element from another Halo game, or even just other games that they brought back. It did not work well in Halo 2, especially the fight with Tartarus in Halo 2. It's not nearly as bad as it was in Halo 2. They now have a bar over their head indicating how much health they have, along with a shield bar. And there aren't countless waves of enemies coming at you, along with a ridiculous shield that you have to wait for Johnson to not, miss in order to bring down. On normal, this fight isn't hard, and it's kind of on the fun side. When you get to Legendary, this fight is kind of garbage. Mainly because Tremonius has a Hydra. Now, if you remember what I said about the AI on Legendary, it's super accurate. And with a Hydra launcher, he will hit you in the head without fail, and he'll kill you in 2 shots. The other thing that I noticed when it came to this fight is that the AI constantly knows where Master Chief is. You can hide behind objects and he'll still shoot at the object whether he has line of sight on Master Chief or not. I wish I had video of this, but I kind of accidentally deleted it. But yes, you can hear the shots constantly hitting whatever I was hiding behind because I couldn't, get a shot out on him because he'd constantly just headshot. He doesn't have a reload or anything to balance that out either. This fight is made even worse if you're doing a lasso run, which I did. And on Legendary / if you're doing a lasso run, he sort of feels like he's a gatekeeper character because if you can beat him, you're probably not going to have any issues with any of the other bosses throughout the rest of the game. Another issue that kind of reared its head when I was fighting bosses, not just Tremonius, but every other boss, is that you can down their shields, and then after that, your projectiles seem to be ineffective. And a lot of the time, I would just melee attack them to death, and that'd be far more effective than shooting them with any weapon. Which on Legendary, or if you're doing a lasso run, is pretty much suicide. Most of the enemies will melee attack you, including grunts, but they won't kill you, even on a lasso run. Brutes and elites, along with all the bosses, will definitely kill you in one hit if they hit you with a melee attack. Even if your health is all the way full and you have full shields. There are ways around that, like using explosives to send them up in the air, in which case they won't melee attack you if they're falling, or if you use the energy sword where you can just constantly pummel them and send them backwards. Elites can still attack you with their own energy sword even if you're using one on them. They'll just ignore the flinch mechanics and stab you right through your own attack. So if you're doing a lasso run, just be cautious with that. After beating Tremonius, they introduced Spartan Cores. Now these are used to enhance Master Chief's armor. In the beginning, it just increases his shield's capacity and enhances grappling hook. Other abilities do become available as you play through the game. They aren't unlocked through experience, but through progression through the main story, kind of like the first Assassin's Creed game. The more you enhance a ability, the more cores it takes. They also introduce a sort of other new mechanic for the open world part of the game, which you have to fight your way through a whole bunch of enemies to get to a landing pad so Echo 216 can land. Chipper Cortana accesses the Banish's battle net and removes it from the map so that they won't return. But after the first one, Master Chief receives a distress call and they go and answer it, going to a completely and totally different part of the map. This is where the open world part of the game starts. It confines Master Chief to a small portion of the map and introduces forward operating bases, not in the same way that they did in Metal Gear Solid 5. The best comparison I can make is any tower in any of the Ubisoft games from the past 10 years. Except you don't have to climb it, you just have to kill all the enemies and get Chipper Cortana to the console, in which you will remove it from the battle net, making it safe for any Marines you rescue along with Chief to go to those locations. You'll also gain access to weapons and vehicles as you progress through the game by earning Valor Points. Valor Points are earned by freeing forward operating bases, rescuing Marines, and shutting down any propaganda towers. You can also unlock weapons and Valor Points by going after targets of interest. These are sort of mini bosses, which they have a unique weapon you can unlock by assassinating these characters. They're kind of like mini bosses. They're not too difficult to kill. They are harder than your typical brute or elite. The grunts are pretty much the same, and you will probably kill the named grunts before you even kill the brutes or elites that are protecting them. But there's kind of a little bit of lore attached to each one, and Chipper Cortana will pitch in and say something about each one and what sort of atrocity they committed. Most of them have a tendency to destroy and kill colonists. So with all that sort of briefly covered, I will talk about the visuals of the ring. It does look like you are on a Halo, and it feels like it too. With the vast size of the ring, it sort of just opened itself up to being an open world game of sorts. The only real downfall to this is that you are on a very small chunk overall of the ring, and you don't get to explore much of it, just a section of it that's been partially destroyed, which I get because there's no way you're going to be able to build the whole entire ring. It would take too long, and there'd just be too much to explore or even do for a game that size if it took up the whole entire ring. But it felt like they could do more than what they did with the ring that they had available. The one thing I did forget to mention is that they have outposts throughout the section of the ring you do get to explore, which it mainly contains sort of a plot element to a degree, along with Spartan cores or maybe even rescuing some Marines. Most of the time it just involves blowing up a good chunk of the facility in order to sabotage the Banish's efforts on the section of the ring that you're in. Then there are other bases, like the tower, which are bigger parts of the map where there's more concentration of Banish. These are more or less areas that contain major portions of the story. You leave the open world section of the ring and go through basically a linear path for the story. Now, traversing this open world area is kind of fun. Most of the time I didn't even bother with a vehicle. It was too cluttered with trees and other things, or the paths didn't take you close to your objectives. So most of the time I just went cross country, constantly using the grappling hook. And it got even more fun when you use the bandana skull, which it pretty much takes the cooldown timer down to 0, so you can just constantly swing through across the ring, covering vast distances quicker than you could probably do with any of the other vehicles. And I found myself sort of doing small challenges for myself. Let's say seeing if I can not touch the ground while swinging as much as possible, trying to grapple onto anything, going from cliff sides to trees, making sure that I try and not touch the ground. It's a bit silly, but I enjoy doing that. So this brings me to the Marines. You do rescue them, like I said before, and they can join you as you go through the map, but most of the time it's kind of pointless, especially on Legendary since they die a lot. Or if you use the grappling hook a lot like me to traverse the terrain, they get left behind because they can't climb or drop down as high as Chief can and keep up with Master Chief. And before I forget, there's one last thing they have in the game, which are skulls. You'd think it'd be a lot harder to find in this game since it's open world, and if the internet didn't exist, yes, they'd be difficult to find. When you find these skulls, it unlocks them for use in the campaign. The only one I still really have a problem with is Black Eye. I don't know why they think melee attacking somebody in order to bring your shields back is a challenge. Yes, it is a challenge, but it's a very flawed challenge, and it's kind of dumb, in my opinion. Especially in a game where they will one-hit kill you anyways, shields or otherwise, especially certain enemies, particularly chieftains or even elites with swords. So I guess this is also a good place to transition to the gun combat in the game. It is good. It really is. It's part of why this game is really fun, along with the abilities that Chief gets, especially the grappling hook. Most of the time I'd use the battle rifle or the pistol. Most of the other guns aren't nearly as good since it's an open world game and you'll be engaging a lot of enemies from a long distance away, unless you're doing a lasso run, in which case I do suggest you grab an energy sword and a rocket launcher. With most of the open world mechanics more or less covered at this point, let's continue with the story. Chief then goes to what they call the Tower. It's a facility where they take soldiers and they torture them. Currently the tower is emitting a distress signal from a Spartan, and it's more or less kind of a fortress, and there is a process of opening up the tower and getting inside, which you get a new armor ability, the Threat Detector, which is more or less a portable version of what the ODST had in Halo 3 ODST. Most of the time you really don't use this except for during boss battles. 2 boss battles in specific, one that's directly in this tower and one that's towards the end of the game. I did use it on another occasion, which I'll cover later. So you fight your way through the tower and you encounter Spartan Griffin being tortured by Chak Lok, the elite that's in charge of the facility and your next boss. This fight was clearly designed around the threat sensor. That's why they introduced it at the beginning of the tower. Again, this boss, once you take down the shields, it's better just to melee attack him somehow in order to kill him. Now this is where I'm sort of confused / think there's a big huge plot hole, in that the Spartans that were on the US Infinite, they keep saying are the last Spartans according to the Banished. I don't think they are, because they never mentioned Blue Team, who was in Halo 5. On top of that, they sort of hint that they only took the best Spartans when they had a communication with Halsey. Throughout the game, they keep referencing the Spartans, but they don't mention how many were on the Infinity. You'll constantly come across logs from, I guess, what were considered the 5 best Spartans that they brought with them next to Master Chief. And I forgot to mention, you do encounter one after you save Chipper Katana, who was killed by an energy blade that was more intense than what they usually have. After beating Chak Lok, you get more access to the part of the ring that the game takes place on. They sort of stopped you by trying to put distance between the chunks of the ring, and even if you did manage to cross those sections of the ring, it would start a countdown timer and just kill you. There is a way around it, which I will go over briefly. So this bigger part of the map just has more of the same thing. Spartan cores, rescuing Marines, killing targets of interest, along with blowing up or sabotaging facilities for the Banished. Here you will encounter small groups of enemies as you traverse the terrain, going from whatever point you're going to either find a Spartan core or rescue Marines, whatever you're doing. This part I enjoyed. The problem is, let's say you complete a major objective, let's say the tower. You go back to that section of the ring, but there aren't nearly as many enemies there, and it's sort of pointless to go back unless you missed something and you want to go find it. And this is kind of compounded at the end of the game, because yes, once you beat the campaign, they put you back on the ring so that you can go and collect anything that you haven't found. But there's far fewer banished, except for in areas where you haven't completed something, like I say, a facility. Which case, yes, there'll be the normal amount of banished, but once you complete that, there's fewer banished in the surrounding area. And if you do come back to the facility, there'll be fewer banished that were there when you first initially. I'm not sure if this is supposed to reflect on Master Chief's one-man army rampage through the banished forces, or maybe they just figured people wouldn't come back or play the game as much once they found everything after this point. Or it could be to the nature that these events are scripted, and once that portion of the game is complete, they rely on the AI for all intents and purposes to fill that gap in, and they don't quite have it to the same degree as what they initially had when you first attacked that facility. Either way, it kind of makes the game feel a little bit empty after you've gone through that portion of the game. The emptiness is amplified by the lack of collectibles in the game as well. Most of them, in particular the Spartan cores and the audio logs, are located around the various banished facilities that you sabotage throughout the game. And there's only a handful of those throughout the game. The environments look good. It feels like a Halo, just more open, especially in comparison to the original Halo and Halo 2 and 3. Like I said before, after you collect everything, it becomes really empty. Yes, it looks good, but there's no reason to go back. I mean, it spawns very few enemies, if any at all. The part that makes this a little bit on the frustrating side is that it's not that big of a map, so I'm not sure why they couldn't add more enemies to the map and not just have empty space. And when you're done collecting everything, there's nothing left to do except for start a whole new game. This isn't a bad thing either. There are more Spartan cores than you actually need to upgrade all of your abilities, so you can just pick and choose which ones you want to do without having to go and do some of them that are more remote and out in the middle of the map. This does raise a few issues or two though. There are aspects to the game that are noticeably missing. For one, campaign co-op. That's not a necessity. It's just been part of Halo, and it feels kind of odd not to have co-op available for the campaign. The ability to replay parts of the campaign that you've already been through is noticeably missing without having to start a whole entire campaign. Other open world games have done this. Grand Theft Auto series has done this. Red Dead Redemption has done this. And considering that parts of these missions are cordoned off for said mission, it should be accessible through a mission selection. I mean, this has been part of Halo since Halo 1. So why they don't have it for this, I don't know. Like I said, it's probably due to time constraints and they just didn't add it. They might add it later, but for now they don't. Getting back to the story, after you go through the tower, you go to the dig site. And here you kill waves of brutes along with some other banished forces. There is an exploit, I don't know if it's in the game. It really doesn't detract or add to the game, but it allows you to be invincible temporarily. If you use it to bypass parts of the game or parts of the story, you will more than likely not get some of Master Chief's armor abilities, which you kind of need if you're doing a lasso run to make it easier on yourself. Not to mention, you won't get credit for completing the whole entire lasso run. Getting back to the story again after that little segue, this is where I have a bit of a problem with some of the enemies in the game, particularly the brute chieftains, or at least for this part of the game. So when you go to turn off the mining laser, a brute chieftain attacks Master Chief. This part of the game is extremely unbalanced, even on normal. In a scripted event, Master Chief is attacked by a brute chieftain with a gravity hammer. This aspect of the game feels extremely unbalanced. Not only do these brute chieftains take a ton of damage, even on easy difficulties, they also deal a great deal of damage and are extremely fast. On lasso runs, they just take minutes upon minutes to kill. It's not a quick, short little bout. It takes a really long time because of the amount of health they give them. And it can get very boring and frustrating, especially when you're doing a lasso run in which they constantly keep killing you because their damage output along with their speed and health aren't balanced very well at all. To compound it, the arena that they put you in is typically not very good either. In the laser drill section, you're put in a very narrow hallway for all intents and purposes, and you're constantly using the grappling hook to get away from the brute chieftain, which is pretty much the case with every encounter with every brute chieftain. Brute chieftains aren't even the worst enemies in the game when it comes to this. After defeating the brute chieftain and turning off the laser, you head into the ring. This part of the game goes from open world back to a linear style of gameplay. This mainly happens when they want to tell a part of the story, and they want to make sure that you don't miss part of it. Master Chief eventually comes upon a monitor for the installation. So I actually could not find this monitor's name on the internet. I had to go back into the game and play all the way through to this point to get its name. And its name is Despondent Pyre. I mean, yes, I probably could have watched someone else's walkthrough to get to it, but I didn't feel like doing that, so I just did it myself. When Despondent Pyre sees Master Chief, it asks for his assistance, and you can see why just a few seconds later when some aliens that you've never seen before grab it and drag it towards the bottom of the facility. You can hear two distinct voices, the monitor and another voice, talking as you progress down trying to reach the monitor in order to save it. When Master Chief reaches the bottom, you can see Despondent Pyre is in pieces and that Master Chief was clearly too late. But a bit of data was left behind, and when Chipper Cortana accesses it, you get a cutscene. This cutscene is a conversation between Despondent Pyre and Cortana talking about access to part of the facility, which Despondent Pyre says the punished must never be released, and that these particular entities are far more dangerous than even the Flood. After the cutscene, Master Chief and Chipper Cortana are attacked by the same aliens that drag Despondent Pyre towards the bottom of the facility. Chipper Cortana dubs them Skimmers, and Master Chief engages in a bit of banter with her over the name because she also wanted to call them Flying Octopus Monsters. It's implied that they were in some of those containers containing different life forms that you saw earlier in the game. So after fighting through several waves of enemies, you go through a hallway where you find another Spartan. This will be the third Spartan, and I kind of forgot to mention the other one that you found earlier that had an armor ability. It was a shield wall, and I usually didn't even bother using it until I did a lasso run. This armor ability isn't new, it's the thruster, which allows you to do a short little dodge. This one's neat though. Once you get it fully upgraded, it adds a bit of a cloak. During my lasso run, I pretty much ended up just spamming this / using it to cover distances because the grappling shot just didn't work at that point. They would just nail me instantly because they're super accurate. This allowed me to not only dodge their shots, but hide from enemies, allowing me to get into melee range with my saber in order to bring my shields back up to full strength. Now there's one thing that's in common with 3 of the Spartans that you found. I'm not sure if you'd count Griffin. I'm not going to because he was still alive, unlike the other Spartans. But they were killed by an energy sword with a higher intensity level. And it's pretty obvious who it is since they call him Blade Master. The last one looked like he was beaten to death. After getting the armor ability, you proceed into basically a giant corridor where you fight 2 brute chieftains with big, huge guns that fire extremely fast. This is still kind of a pain in the butt, but it's not nearly as bad as the fight with Bassus. You know, that room with the laser control, where it was extremely narrow and had a low ceiling. This one, there's plenty of places to take cover, which I'm not entirely sure why they didn't take the same concepts or even design for these 2 chieftains and apply it to that fight with Bassus. Which, on a sort of note, it's not the only time they do this either, and it actually gets worse, where they put you in tiny little rooms with almost no room to go, in a room with a bunch of chieftains and other brutes with no real cover. I digress. After you defeat the 2 chieftains and take a lift all the way up, you run into a new character, the Harbinger of Truth. This is another alien similar to the skimmers that we've never seen before. She can teleport around and basically kind of beats Chief up.
I know you have been following me. We are not enemies.
Despondent pyre.
She has something I required.
After the cutscene, you find yourself on the surface of the ring again, and you see a tower off in the distance. So there's a signal coming from this tower, and Chief starts making his way there, fighting through waves of banished enemies. You can also continue to explore the part of the ring that you can access. If you've sort of collected everything at this point, there's only like a couple FOBs and maybe a couple of Spartan cores to get. Otherwise, there's not much to this part of the map, and you can even access it before you even get to this part in the game, which I did. There are other parts you can get to, but if you do, the game will kill you, or in some cases, it'll automatically shoot you down if you try to fly there using a Banshee or a Wasp. At the base of the tower, they introduce hunters for the first time, and you'll run into them several times throughout the campaign. And they are some of the hardest enemies in the game, if not the hardest. Especially with Lasso, these enemies are just bosses. They're actually harder than any of the bosses I fought in the game. And there's just a fundamental imbalance to these enemies. They took everything they may have learned from the previous Halos and just threw it out the window. Yes, in Halo 1, if you didn't know that you could just shoot them with a pistol or sniper rifle in the stomach or the back, they were super easy. But here, it's like they took everything they learned and even did in previous Halos, including Halo 5, and just threw it out the window. They look great, yes. That's not where the problem is. The problem comes in, particularly when it comes to their attacks, in any form, melee or ranged, along with even just sound design of these enemies. So in every previous Halo, their main attack, which is the charged plasma cannon, will fire, and they telegraph this. They sort of do it, but the interval is very short, and they can shoot off another burst right after that first one, instead of having to charge it again. The other issue they have is that they have a secondary fire, which is supposed to be a smaller, rapidly firing gun. In this case, in this game, they made it so that they all explode. And combined with Legendary and with Lasso, every one of those shots will hit without fail. Even mid-air, even when you're dodging. They failed to balance the rate of fire and the speed of the weapon with the amount of damage it can do. On top of that, if you a melee attack, it's instant. There's no wind up or anything like that. There's 0 frames between wherever its shield is and it's attacking. It automatically just jumps to the melee attack animation. And pretty much every Halo, yes, their melee attacks did get a little quicker. There was still a bit of a wind up to it. Here, it's just instant. Everything that they learned or even took from the previous games when it comes to hunters and just threw it out the window and made them super overpowered and super difficult to fight. Yes, you can blow the armor off and attack its squishy orange parts along with shooting them in the joints, but even with that, it takes a lot of ammunition to take these things down. It's completely and totally unbalanced, and it's probably the worst part of this game, to be honest, are the hunters and their design. I almost forgot when I said sound. If you go back to the first Halo, let's just take a small, short look at that. Or I should say listen in this case. You can hear them clunking around with their armor. In this game, they're pretty much silent outside of maybe an occasional grrr. You don't hear the armor clanking, you don't hear any footsteps, and they'll just appear right behind you without you knowing.
Oop, don't answer that. Just get rid of them so I can get us in.
And as far as I'm concerned, they failed with the hunters in Halo Infinite. And the worst part about this is they're in the game multiple times, which is not something you should not expect from this game. The problem is, one of the things you can do to balance out the game is also add elements to the arena, such as cover. They have multiple parts in this game where they put you in tiny little rooms with almost no cover, and in some cases, it might as well have been no cover at all. I did go on a bit of a tangent there, and I'm definitely going to return to it when I get to the part where I just mentioned where you're in a tiny little room with no cover. But when you get to the top of the tower, you come across another monitor. This monitor was created by Despondent Pyre. Kind of reminds me of Alien Resurrection, where they had a synth designed and created by other synths. Oh. I mean, for all intents and purposes, he's just another monitor. And his name is Adjutant Resolution. Chipper Cortana says maybe you should trust him, and Master Chief is like, let's see. When you get to the control room of the tower, he tries to kill Master Chief, and I guess a sort of exoskeleton for the monitors, increasing their combat capabilities. So the tower they're in isn't actually a tower, it's called a spire, and they're one of many throughout the whole entire ring, and they're supposed to repair the ring. In this case, they stop it, which causes it to sort of start collapsing, and Echo 216 comes and rescues them. While rescuing them, they run into 3 anti-air cannons, and the Pelican gets shot down in an area that's called the Graveyard. And it's called the Graveyard because that's where a great deal of UNSC ships crashed, along with a lot of their naval forces. This part of the game isn't like others. There's no FOBs on this section of the ring. There are Spartan cores, but you still have an objective, in this case the 3 anti-aircraft turrets. It still follows a similar formula from all the other gameplay we've had so far, which is to find a console, open up a core, and destroy it and get out before it blows up. But there's a bit of story element with this one, in which Escharum shows up for 2 of the 3 guns, and sort of monologues to Chief about a whole bunch of things, including Spartan killers. It's pretty obvious who one of them is. You've seen them in the cutscenes. It's the Blade Master. And considering that 3 out of the 4 Spartans you find were killed by energy blades, it's pretty obvious that it's him as well. The last Spartan that you found, it was insinuated it was killed by the brutes, and I'm pretty sure it's supposed to be the 2 brutes that they send after you at this point in time of the game. So these 2 Spartan killers pretty much play like any other boss character in the game, or let's just say named character. They're tougher, yes, but they're not that much of a challenge. After beating them, you go and find Echo 216, who talks about finding not 1, not 2, but 3 condors, which are supposed to be rare ships that are small but can travel in slip space. Unfortunately, all 3 of them are destroyed, and their slip space drives have been destroyed with them. He has a bit of a brief mental meltdown, and Chief does what he can to help him, and he does eventually calm down, sort of building a bond between him and Chief, along with Chipper Cortana. So this next part kind of confuses me because they either got a new Pelican or they repaired their Pelican. I'm not sure which. They really don't show or even tell in this case. It's an issue with the writing in the story for Halo Infinite. After getting on the new Pelican, or the repaired one, whatever one it is, doesn't matter, Master Chief is then dropped off at another spire. This one is supposed to be the spire that's controlling all the other spires in the area. Chipper Cortana can't hack the door, and this is because the Harbinger of Truth is messing with the systems that allow her to actually open the doors. So now you have to go to all these towers, like you've seen in the original Halo, the one where you meet Sergeant Johnson for the first time, and you have to download data that allows you to open the door, or I should say allows Chipper Cortana to open the door. This part of the game encompasses the most area for the most part. And if you're like me, you had enough valor to have a wasp be dropped off at any FOB that you go to, and there's one right outside the entrance to the spire. Now there's one thing I sort of didn't go over, but I'm going to cover now because it really wasn't an issue. There are 4 ammo types in Halo Infinite. There's kinetic, which covers basically everything human or anything that doesn't shoot energy of any kind, plasma, electric, and hard light. So Sentinel weapons use hard light ammo, and electric is something they added to the game. In this case, it's sort of more or less replaced the plasma pistol. They now have like a rifle and a pistol that can now stun vehicles, and each ammo type refills its respective weapon that it goes with. So now you can actually reload plasma-based weapons, unlike in the past where you just had to dump them once you used everything up. The reason why I avoided is you really didn't see too many of the electric weapons in the game up until this point. Now here's the problem with them. Even on normal difficulties, and probably even on easy, like I said, they're really good shots. Even with pistols. And most of the time you can't even see that you're getting hit by any of these weaponry, especially if you're flying high in a wasp. In which case your wasp is going to go crashing towards the ground and you won't even know why because you can't even see the projectiles hitting your vehicle. Yes, I covered this, but it's actually a bit of a detriment to any vehicle that you use. It doesn't matter which vehicle. It just is. They will constantly stun you all the time because they cannot miss. It's not that they won't miss, it's just they can't because they programmed them not to, which is a very distinct negative, and it's very lazy in their game design. On top of this, this is where I actually started using vehicles due to the distance that needed to be covered, and in some cases they're sort of segmented off by part of the ring, so a wasp was just easier to use than using the grapple shot to get up. But this sort of brought to light how bad the vehicles are in this game. Outside of the Wasp or the Ghost, most of them had issues with shooting and killing basic infantry. The only vehicle that can reliably take out other vehicles, especially heavier vehicles like Wraiths, is the Scorpion. Yes, there are other Wraiths in the game, but you won't see those or even get to use them till late in the game, and it's only for a short bit. The Wasp, with its rockets, can't take anything big down like the Wraith itself. Yes, it can take down Ghosts and Choppers, but that's it. I guess Banshees too. But when it came to like the few Wraiths that are in the game that you can shoot, it can't even make a dent in its shield, let alone its armor. I did use the Wasp for the most part in my first playthrough, just for the convenience of getting around. In later playthroughs, I just stuck to the grappling hook, especially after I got the bandana skull. One of the bigger problems is that they would spawn in banshees above any outpost, even after it's been destroyed or sabotaged, and they would just appear right in front of you. They wouldn't even come up from a distance, and they would just automatically start shooting you perfectly. And the Wasp, regardless of its ability to hover, could barely turn fast enough to lock on. Yes, there's some skill involved, but it's basically nullified by how the AI and the maneuverability of the Wasp. You had no choice but to take damage. There's no mitigating it, or very little mitigating in terms of damage. I think they may have corrected that, because I did play a little bit recently to get some more footage, and I didn't see any banshees spawn when I was flying a Wasp around. Doesn't mean it's still there. I didn't fly over too many outposts, mainly because I knew what I was doing and where I was going. So with that said, I'm just going to cover this area briefly, mainly because it's basically just more of the same. Recapture FOBs, save Marines, and gather Spartan cores. Now there's enough Spartan cores in the game that you don't need to collect them all in order to max out your armor's abilities. So at each objective, Chipper Cortana sort of feels a presence that she knows is searching for her. After the 4th terminal, and Chipper Cortana sort of had a brush up with what is apparently the Harbinger of Truth, Master Chief starts to initiate the AI deletion protocols. He stops when he sees that Chipper Cortana is fine, and she sort of picked up on it that he said something, which in this case, the starting protocol, I guess, was red flag. After going all the way back to the spire and fighting through waves of enemies again, you get to a point where Chipper Cortana access the systems in order to shut down the spires. The Master Chief, in anticipation that she might be compromised, starts up the AI deletion sequence again. When Chipper Cortana is hacking the system for all intents and purposes, she is being attacked by the Harbinger of Truth, and the Master Chief initiates the deletion protocols. If you watch this segment of the cutscene, you can see some, I guess, homages to material that wasn't in any of the games, like Samuel, or Sam, which is one of Master Chief's friends from boot camp or training camp before he became a full-fledged Spartan, and he was the first Spartan to die. I mean, he took out a whole entire Covenant ship in the process. He went out with his boots on. Back to the story of the game. After the countdown goes down and Chipper Cortana says, "I thought we were a team," it sort of makes you try and think that he actually succeeded, but he turns around and there she is, very upset that the Master Chief tried to delete her, and he's like, "You tried to stop me," and she's like, "I'm an infiltration program," and shows that she got the little bit of data that was stolen from the monitor in order to get the spires to repair the ring. It seems kind of out of place, since when you first saw her, she's like, "Why haven't you deleted me?" I mean, just watch the cutscene when they introduce the character.
On successful deployment, my deletion routine was supposed to complete. Still here.
Good.
Good. My programming failed. I'm not supposed to be here. You need to delete me.
But she definitely wasn't happy about Master Chief's attempt to delete her. And you can tell by the dialogue that she has with him for the next couple of hours of the game, depending on how long it takes you to get through it.
You, trying to help us. It was worth the risk. It doesn't matter. There's your grav lift. Let's get this over with.
So as you progress through the spire, you can see that the ring is producing materials to repair itself. In this case, they're just trying to repair part of it, the auditorium. They don't know exactly what that is. The Harbinger of Truth does, but everyone else doesn't. So after fighting through more enemies, you come across Adjutant Resolution again. And it's almost the exact same fight as before. There's a different layout to the arena, and they have sentinels coming in behind you. And Chipper Cortana says, "Look, he brought friends," still showing that bitterness of almost being deleted by the Master Chief. So why they decide to use the same boss again, I don't know. There's not much difference to the fight with the addition of the Sentinels. And I started getting Halo 5 flashbacks, hoping at this point when I initially played that I wouldn't see this boss again, and thankfully we don't. After getting to the top of the spire and shutting down all the spires, they have sort of a moment in which Master Chief is showing some vulnerability, considering how close he was with Cortana and what happened to her, and along with the possibility of what's going to happen with Chipper Cortana. I'm still not entirely sure why she's as angry as she was. She has a line in this cutscene that says, "I was supposed to be deleted." She then points out everything that she's done to help Master Chief, and I guess this is supposed to convey that there's a fine line, or it's very blurred, that yes, she may be an AI, but she still has feelings, and that she's more or less, for all intents and purposes, human, and felt betrayed by Master Chief. There is an explanation for why he tried to do what he did, and it has to do with Cortana. In the middle of their conversation, Echo 216 shows up, and the Blade Master takes him prisoner. How he got on there, I don't know. I guess he just sat in the back of the Pelican until the Master Chief showed up, or he showed up to the Master Chief and took him prisoner. Chipper Cortana opens a portal for him and he jumps through. When Master Chief arrives at the other end of the portal, you wind up in another part of the ring. And at this point, the game is actually starting to, or I should say, it's repeating itself again. We've seen this hallway multiple times throughout the game every time we go into the ring. I mean, the first time we saw it, it was destroyed, and then we saw it intact later, and here it is again. It's even the same layout. I get it, it's a common theme for game developers to reuse assets. But in this case, they didn't really do much except for change up the enemy types in the hallway, passageway, corridor, whatever it is. Like I said earlier, it's starting to feel like a Halo game, particularly the first Halo. The pair come across a terminal and Chipper Cortana accesses it. She says they're below a big banished facility and there's a message for the chief. It's Esram showing that he has Echo 216 and that he's torturing him, and he's more or less bait for the obvious trap. After proceeding through the ring, you eventually come to a window and Chipper Cortana tells you to stop. She says she recognizes a structure off in the distance, not by sight but by signal, and that it's the building that she locked down Cortana in, which explains part of the story later on. As you proceed even further into the facility after this, you start hearing whispers of Cortana, and you come across a console in which it shows a facility and the AI that controls it, Leonidas, who then destroys the facility, which is the Spartan training facility. And Chipper Cortana is clearly shocked by her actions. Eventually, the Master Chief comes across the lift he has to activate, and after activating it, you get a cutscene, or sort of a cutscene, in which Cortana is talking to Lord Hood, demanding his surrender, and that of the UNSCs. She then attacks Sydney, the headquarters of the UNSC on Earth, destroying it. Chipper Cortana shows her surprise at her actions yet again. There's one thing I wanted to cover before I moved on, and that's when Master Chief retrieves the power cells from the two rooms, because you have to fight not one, but two brute chieftains in each room. These chieftains were far more difficult than any of the named bosses in the game. Especially when you're doing a lasso run, it just felt like nothing was working on them. I launched rocket after rocket, and it took forever to kill them. And it might have gone better with a sniper rifle, but there's a reason why I took the rocket launcher. And that's because the physics of the rocket launcher with all the skulls activated has a tendency to send them flying and makes it a lot easier to kill certain enemies. In this case, it didn't seem to work at all. On top of that, the arenas that they created for these rooms are just poorly done. Yet again, there's no cover whatsoever, and they have a tendency to be bullet sponges, or in this case, rocket sponges. So after the cutscene with Lord Hood, you proceed through the ring even further, in which you come across another point in which you install more power cells. It seems like they kind of ran out of ideas and just started to repeat or reuse ideas at this point. Like I said before, it's common for that to happen, but to the degree that it's happening in this game, it just doesn't feel like they thought this part out. I know they wanted to convey a part of the story, but you could still do that without making you go and get more power cells. Anyways, another cutscene plays after you get all the power cells, and it shows what Cortana did, which I guess is the most egregious thing she did. She's talking to Atriox, trying to get him to surrender, and when he refuses, she destroys a whole entire planet, as in the brute homeworld. This clearly enrages Atriox, and during this cutscene, Chipper Cortana realizes something that everyone knew from the very start when Echo 216 said she looked just like Cortana, and that she's a copy of Cortana. It feels kind of disappointing that they thought this would be some huge revelation.
This is part of me. I don't know why. I don't know how, but it is me. It was the last part I remember being deleted. Let me just... Hi.
What the? Cortana? What's she?
When it was clearly obvious from the very start what she was, especially if you've read any of the material from the Halo series or canon, you knew that they could make copies. Upon this realization, Chipper Cortana sort of gets why Master Chief has had trust issues with her. That the fear that she might become another Cortana, just like Cortana, and try and subjugate and destroy everybody and everything. She then asks Chief to delete her, but he refuses and takes her with him, and they go off to save Echo 216 together. When Master Chief reaches the surface of the ring, there's clearly a road that leads all the way to a building way off in the distance, called the House of Reckoning. And as a player, you have to fight through several waves of enemies to get to it. This part of the game feels more like an homage to the first Halo. They even play some of the music from the first game, which I'm pretty sure is a version of the Truth and Reconciliation song, or at least parts of it. This part of the game is fun, and in general, one of the few times you actually have a use for a vehicle due to the number of enemies and other vehicles to destroy, particularly because you get to use the Scorpion tank. There are wraiths, but they're still not as good as the Scorpion due to how they fire and not being able to see unless you fire and then quickly point the camera down and then make adjustments accordingly. On top of that, there's an achievement to get the tank all the way to the House of the Banished, and it's called Sheila, which is a reference to a red versus blue character. When Master Chief enters the House of Reckoning, they have set up an arena based around UNSC's sort of weaponry and structures. And it's the Banished's explanation of how they were so able to soundly defeat the UNSC when they showed up to the ring. The thing is, they even mentioned that this is where they bring the prisoners after they torture them from the tower. So in order to train for their presence, they would have to get UNSC forces before they could capture the ones off of Infinity, which is the ones they've been torturing. So this whole entire part doesn't make sense unless it's supposed to be sort of a retroactive explanation of what happened to the Spirit of Fire crew. There's no hint or even mention of the Spirit of Fire crew, so I'm not entirely sure. So it seems kind of pointless to take prisoners from a group of people you've already soundly beaten and then use them to train to beat more of them. I guess it was supposed to be in preparation for fighting Spartans and the Master Chief. I'm not sure. They don't do a good job explaining this part at all. But I will give them prompts. The arena in this part of the game is probably some of the best throughout the whole entire game so far, with plenty of cover and weapons and all that other fun stuff when it comes to fighting. After going through 2 of these arenas and fighting another pair of red hunters, you come across the Blade Master. This fight is more or less functionally the same as the tower boss. Aside from not having a firearm of any kind, the fight is functionally the same. Yes, he's more deadly because he's supposed to be since he has the intensified energy blades, but the fight is pretty much the same. On the lasso run that I did, he was somewhat difficult, and oddly enough, I had a harder time with him the first time I fought him when I had all the armor abilities versus the second time when I used an exploit to skip to the House of Reckoning, bypassing most of the game and missing out on several armor abilities. So after defeating him, you go and you find Echo 216 being tortured, and as you approach him, there's a cutscene where Escharum approaches. Now this next part of the game really irritates me because it's similar setups that were even in the first Halo and they didn't learn from it at all. And that's when you finish the cutscene, you are face to face with Escharum and he's holding a cannon that can fire really fast and it hits like a brick. No cover, nothing. Unless you knew it was going to happen, you're going to get hit in the face. And even if you did know it was going to happen and reacted to it, based on how accurate the AI is, you're still going to get a hit. And when I did my lasso run, I almost died because he shot me that fast. So this is where my biggest problem comes in, because they had not one, but two scenarios in the very first Halo, in which the cutscene sets up a fight that's going to occur when it ends. So as part of the cutscene, they show Master Chief taking cover behind something, and when the cutscene ends and the battle begins, you're behind cover. That way you aren't utterly destroyed by whatever's attacking you right off the bat. They didn't do that here. I don't know why, but they didn't do it, and it's just really bad game design to have not set that up. So the fight with Escharum isn't exactly new. Yes, the arena is arguably better, especially with all the weapons they give you, which you'll more than likely need them depending on what difficulty level and skulls you have activated. It unfortunately feels way too much like the fight with Brutus, the same chieftain that you fought in the laser control room. It also has the same feeling as the brute chieftains that walk around with the autocannons as well. It's like they just combined the two and thought that would make for a good boss fight. They did try and mix it up a little bit by having a scenario in which a shield popped up, and if you did damage to it, it would cause harm to Echo 216, resulting in a scenario where you have to disable the shield by shooting more of the same yellow panels as you did throughout the whole entire game. After beating Escharum, though, you have a cutscene when you're talking to 216, and he comes over and Master Chief sort of comforts him in a way with the explanation that he's a soldier and he's doing what he was supposed to do as a soldier. After this, Master Chief is dropped off by Echo 216 on another part of the ring close to the auditorium. I know I keep saying this, but you fight through enemies, and it's not the problem I have with, yes, there's going to be repetition in any game, and fighting them in a first-person shooter is going to be part of that. That's not the problem I have. No one wants to hear a one-to-one commentary of me going through the whole entire game with every encounter. I do stop and try and cover encounters that I think are of note. As you go towards the auditorium, you see more echoes of Cortana appearing every now and then, saying things that she said before. Which leads me to the most infuriating part of the game that I fought in. So there's another encounter with hunters, and I've already said my piece on how poorly designed they are in this game. But this time, for whatever reason, they seem far tougher than their brethren have been throughout the whole entire game. In combination with the poorly designed arena. I mean, in this room, there's a glass wall and 4 pillars. There are some containers off to the side that can provide cover, but there's one little nook and cranny I'll show you. But otherwise, that's it for cover. And even then, they have ammo containers around them, which potentially will kill you, so you can set those off to negate that potential danger to the chief. But it's still a poorly thought out arena. And I suspect that these hunters have been souped up to be far stronger than their brethren. I had footage of it, of me launching rocket after rocket after rocket, trying to kill them, and they would not die. They did add weaknesses to the joints in which you can shoot them there, but they move around so much and the shield protects them most of the time. And the back panel still gets blown off and exposes this orange squishy area. But they can turn on a dime, so you can't even attack that even if you wanted to. So I'll just briefly show you on the screen the little itty bitty hiding place that I had to use on one of my playthroughs, the one where I tried to negate a good chunk of the game, which the only thing I had was a rocket. And I found a tiny little space that allowed me to attack the hunters through, which didn't completely negate the damage that they could do to me, because they could still kill you in like 1 to 2 hits. And as I keep saying, they're really good shots. I mean, they can thread their shots right through this tiny little gap that I'm going to show you. So be careful of that if you try to use this as a means to kill them, which you can, it just takes a while. I eventually killed them on my legitimate lasso run by getting super frustrated and just going all out with the brute hammer that I got from Escharum. After this grueling fight with the 2 hunters, you eventually make it to the main room of the auditorium, and you have a rematch with the Harbinger of Truth. This boss fight is really easy in comparison to the other ones. It's arguably that the ads or all the banished forces she brings in are far more difficult than she actually is, including the brute chieftain that comes in the last wave. And if you have the bandana skull and Escherum's hammer, it is even easier, especially on a lasso run. So the Arbiter of Truth teleports around and you have to try and land a hit in. When you do down her shields, she collapses to the ground and you can land several hits on her. She does this 3 times before she's defeated. And the point of this is to disrupt the signals she's sending out searching for something. Unfortunately, you sort of more or less did not stop her, and the signal gets out, setting up for sequels that there's a bigger threat coming, bigger than even the Flood. And the cutscene continues with Cortana showing up, or I should say an echo of Cortana, showing what happened. Atriox shows up in the room with Cortana as the Master Chief shows up. Or it's after, I'm not entirely sure, because they show the UNSC Infinity coming out of slip space. And she thinks Master Chief is showing up, but it's Atriox. At this point, I sort of wondered, why didn't she, leave, because she's on a network. But then I remember the line from before in which Chipper Cortana said she locked her down, so she's stuck here. And that's how Atriox was able to confront her. On top of that, she realizes how they managed to do this, and that's with a copy of herself. She then asks Atriox if he would do anything different, knowing how he was going to die. He gives his answer, and she does what she needs to do in order to make amends for what she's done, and she blows up the ring along with herself. The auditorium starts to fall apart, and a portal appears, allowing Master Chief to go through and escape. He exits the other side of the portal 3 days later, in which Echo 216 comes and picks him up. Chipper Cortana then asks what his name is, because they've always been calling him Echo 216, and his name is Fernando Esparza. He asks what they should call Chipper Cortana. They don't answer, but I'm pretty sure they're going to choose Cortana. And the credits roll. So, was Halo Infinite better than Halo 4 and 5? Yes. In terms of its gameplay, for the most part, yes. In terms of its story, yes. Is it as good as Halo 2, 3, or even the original Halo? No, not really, but those are some high bars to pass. In some cases, technically, yes, it's far better than even the first Halo. But I found myself playing the game over and over again just to capture more footage of parts that I had lost and wanted to re-record, and found myself bored and sort of just dreading going through the game over again. Now, this is probably nostalgia speaking, but I didn't have that same issue with the original Halo or even Halo 3. Maybe a little bit with 2 due to the boss fights and the story, but I found myself just tired of this game, and I probably won't return to it unless they add some more to it. Maybe when they come out with co-op, if that ever comes out, I'll play it again with my little brother or a friend. And I honestly don't care about the multiplayer aspect of the game, so I'm not even going to touch it for the purposes of this review. I did get some of the achievements, but I just didn't care for the multiplayer enough to try and get all of them. There are some aspects to the story that are glaringly wrong. A big problem with it is that 6-month gap that they had after Master Chief was beaten by Atriox. I'm not sure why they chose that amount of time. It sort of brings up, how did Master Chief survive even in his armor for that long? Same for Echo 216. I almost thought that the beginning cutscene with him in the Pelican was just a glitch with it not rendering his hair and his beard. But then I realized it was to show a passage of time. They didn't need to do 6 months. I don't know why they did 6 months. You could have just done a couple of hours or even days, and it wouldn't have affected the story. Some of the most glaring plot holes are how did Chipper Cortana get down if Master Chief was defeated on the Infinity? And I don't want to engage in apologetics for the big, huge, glaring plot hole. There are negative aspects to the game, such as the brute chieftains and the hunters being way too tough, especially on a legendary with all the skulls on. When I sit there for 10 minutes shooting them with rockets and they don't die, there's something wrong with your game design. And definitely at the end, it does come a little bit repetitive in terms of its environment, reusing assets that they already used from the beginning of the game and in the middle as well. But as cynical as I am, I'll admit I had fun. I mean, eventually it did sort of drone on, and that's because I had to play it a lot in a short amount of time. But, like I said, I had fun with the game. I enjoyed the new armor abilities, particularly the grappling hook. The ability to grab the containers and toss them at banished forces. I just wish the vehicles were a little bit more effective. The Wasp and the Banshee couldn't even do damage to anything bigger than a ghost. And on a lasso run, the vehicles were just virtually useless. The game is definitely a good step in the right direction in terms of making Halo a much better and more popular series again. I actually look forward to what they're going to do with the sequel if it ever comes out. So Halo Infinite was able to salvage the Halo series. For me, this was going to be the last game if it wasn't even remotely entertaining. And considering how a lot of the shooters I used to play have just turned to trash, it's nice to see that effort was actually put into the game, as you can tell from the constant delays it went through. I'm just curious what they're going to turn the game into. Is it going to be sort of like a games of a service thing based around the multiplayer and the campaign of this game? Or are they going to do a direct sequel? Is the game worth buying? I felt like it is, but I want to wait and see until they add more to the game. Let's face it, it was not finished. There's a lack of menus to navigate to parts of the game you might want to replay again, which I don't know why they didn't have. No co-op and other things like that. But if you say you have Game Pass, yes, give the game a go. Try it and play it. If you like it enough, buy it. So if you made it this far into the video, thank you for watching. Please like and subscribe.